Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are embarking on a really monumental intellectual journey. We're plunging right into the life and legacy of a figure whose influence, well, it pretty much defines our modern digital landscape. Augusta Ada King, Countess of Lovelace.
It's a truly fascinating one. I mean, this is a deep dive that sits at this perfect, almost impossible intersection of, Victorian high society, 19th century mechanical genius, and what you can only really call prophetic philosophy.
Yeah, prophetic is the word.
Our sources, they just reveal this wondrously complex portrait. She's a brilliant analyst whose entire life was constantly shadowed by her infamous father, Lord Byron.
Right.
And yet somehow she managed to use that shadow as, well, fuel for her intellectual fire.
Absolutely. So the mission for us today is to really meticulously analyze the sources, the biographical details that explain this unique, almost pressure cooker upbringing she had, and then get into her intensive collaboration with Charles Babbage on the Analytical Engine. The specifics of her mathematical contributions, which, of course, culminate in the famous Note G, and that just extraordinary, almost mystical foresight she had.
And I think the big picture nugget we want you, the listener, to grasp right from the start is this. Yes, Lovelace is often celebrated as the first computer programmer.
Which is huge, of course.
It's huge, and it's important. But her true world-changing brilliance lies not just in writing an algorithm, but in being the first person on Earth to recognize that the machine's potential went way beyond just pure number crunching.
So it wasn't just a big calculator to her.
Not at all.
Yeah.
She saw that Babbage's invention was a symbolic manipulator. It was capable of almost anything, far beyond what even Babbage himself saw.
So our deep dive today is really designed to unpack that entire remarkable journey. We'll explore the personal pressures that shaped her, this unique intellectual method she called poetical science.
Which is such a great term.
Isn't it? And how that synthesis of logic and, imagination allowed her to make this quantum leap from mere calculation, which is what Babbage saw too, true abstract computation. She anticipated the entire digital age by a century. Okay, so to understand the analytical genius of Ada Lovelace, you really have to start with the long, deep shadow cast by her father, the incandescent romantic poet Lord Byron.
Right.
She was born Honorable Augusta Ada Byron in 1815, and right from the moment she was born, there was this immediate emotional rejection.
It's just the most heartbreaking start, isn't it? Byron, a man who was just defined by drama and passion, had famously expected a glorious boy
Yeah.
to carry on his name, his legacy, and he was just openly, crushingly disappointed that the child was a girl. The relationship between him and his wife, Anne Isabella Milbank, it barely lasted 5 weeks after Ada's birth.
Just 5 weeks. And that completely set the course for her entire life.
Yeah.
Lady Byron separated from him, and then Lord Byron left England forever. He never came back.
And he died in Greece when Ada was only 8.
So she never knew him. No personal relationship at all. And yet his notorious life, his poetry, his scandals, his reputation, that was the dominant factor shaping her entire education.
And that notoriety, combined with Lady Byron's, let's call it an intense personality.
A very intense personality.
It drove this extreme, almost pathological educational philosophy. Lady Byron became obsessively anxious that her daughter might inherit her father's perceived insanity.
Which to her meant poetry, passion, that artistic temperament.
Exactly. She saw it as a kind of moral deviance.
So the education itself became a form of a calculated intellectual antidote. If poetry was the poison, then mathematics and logic are the cure.
Precisely. Lady Byron pushed this incredibly rigorous education for Lovelace that was focused almost entirely on mathematics, logic, and objective science right from the earliest possible age. She saw these disciplines as, solid, rational anchors.
They were designed specifically to root out any trace of the Byronic spirit.
Any emotional or moral deviation. It was a calculated defense mechanism against her own husband's influence, even after he was dead.
And this focus on stamping out the father's influence, it created such a deeply cold and controlling environment for young Ada. I mean, the biographical accounts, they offer some really shocking evidence of this detachment. I'm thinking of Lady Byron's letters.
Oh, the letters, yes. They paint just a bleak, bleak picture of emotional neglect that was kind of disguised as intellectual control.
Right.
Lady Byron's detachment was so profound that in one letter to her own mother, she referred to young Ada, her only child, as it.
Is chilling. It.
She wrote, "I talk to it for your satisfaction, not my own." It's just, referring to your own infant daughter as it speaks to a monumental distance.
It really does. It sounds less like motherly care and more like some kind of high-stakes scientific experiment in child rearing.
Well, it certainly was high-stakes control. And that scrutiny, it didn't stop when she was a baby. Lady Byron kept this up well into Ada's teenage years. She even enlisted her close friends to watch her daughter for any sign of moral transgression.
And Lovelace had a name for them, didn't she?
He did. She scornfully called them the Furies.
So she wasn't just being educated. She was being constantly surveilled for signs of genetic failure, basically. It must have been such a profoundly challenging psychological environment.
I can't imagine one where your intellectual growth is pushed to the absolute extreme, but your emotional life is just stifled and watched at every single turn.
And yet, despite all this pressure and her often poor health, she just pursued her studies so assiduously.
Yeah, her early life was very difficult physically.
It really was. We focused so much on her mind, but her body was often frail. She had this severe bout of measles that left her temporarily paralyzed when she was a teenager. She was in bed for nearly a year.
And the chronic headaches.
Right, from the age of 8, chronic headaches that would obscure her vision. But these challenges, they seem to have only sharpened her focus.
And this is where we see the first wonderful signs of her inherent blend of imagination and methodical scientific investigation. The very essence of what she would later call her poetical science.
You're talking about flyology.
Of course, the legendary story of flyology.
This is such a great anecdote. Okay, so at age 12, Lovelace decides she wants to fly. And this isn't just some childish fantasy. She approaches it as a dedicated engineering project.
Absolutely. She didn't just dream of flying. She wanted to understand the rules, the mechanisms of flight. So she started this methodical project to build wings.
The sources detail how she was investigating all these different materials: paper, oil silk, wires, feathers. She was thinking about their tensile strength, their weight distribution.
And then she takes it a step further. She starts studying the anatomy of birds to determine the correct proportional relationship between wingspan and body weight.
She's essentially performing biomechanical calculations to find the optimal design at 12.
And she planned to compile all of her findings into a book, which she was going to call Flyology, complete with illustrations of her prototypes and her hypotheses.
But the real kicker, the part that's so prophetic, is the final step she planned.
Integrating steam power into the art of flying.
Integrating steam, I mean, that immediately moves the project from just natural science into industrial mechanical application.
Yeah.
Even at 12, her imagination went straight to applying abstract principles to a powered machine.
It's a perfect early demonstration of how she always saw a mechanical process, a physical engineered machine, as the endpoint of a mathematical abstraction. She wasn't just a theorist, she was a systems builder, even back then.
So moving into her adult life, despite these constraints, she was still very much a part of Victorian society. She married William King, the 8th Baron King, in 1835.
Who was later made the Earl of Lovelace, which is where her title, the Countess of Lovelace, comes from.
Right, and the marriage gave her some stability. They had 3 children. She was presented at court at 17. She was described as a popular belle of the season.
Praised as much for her mind as for her beauty and charm.
But that high-stakes drama from her youth, it never really left her. The sources hint at earlier scandals, like an attempted elopement with a tutor in 1833.
Which her mother and the Furies quickly suppressed, of course, to protect the family name.
And then came the gambling, the catastrophic venture into gambling in the 1840s, where her mathematical genius just tragically intersected with, I guess, personal desperation.
Yeah, she tried to use her analytical skills to conquer the randomness of the racetrack.
The ultimate application of logic to chance. It proved ruinous. She lost a tremendous amount of money, over 3,000 pounds on horses.
Which was an enormous sum for the time. And it wasn't just impulsive betting, it was a dedicated analytical project. In 1851, she formed a syndicate with some male friends to try and create an infallible mathematical model for winning bets.
They had complex tables and formulas, trying to treat the odds like a solvable equation.
And it was just a total disaster. It forced her to confess these huge, ruinous debts to her husband, which, as we'll see later, had some really lasting, tragic consequences.
It's such a striking duality, isn't it? This is the woman who could see the abstract universal power of a machine that didn't even exist yet.
Right. And at the same time, she's applying that same powerful mind in this desperate, flawed attempt to model horse racing for personal gain. It really highlights that deep human struggle between logic and passion that defined her whole life.
And that deeply human tension between, poetry and logic is what makes her intellectual legacy so compelling. Let's pivot now to the period that really cemented her place in history, her advanced studies, her philosophy, and her partnership with Charles Babbage.
So her introduction to advanced math, it came kind of ironically through people outside the formal academic system.
A system that would have excluded her as a woman.
Completely. Her early tutors were William Friend, another William King, but the crucial figure was Mary Somerville.
Mary Somerville, who was a brilliant scientific author and a huge advocate for women's education. And she was the one who introduced Lovelace to Charles Babbage in 1833.
And later, Lovelace studied with the mathematician Augustus de Morgan, who taught her advanced calculus, including the critical concepts behind the numbers of Bernoulli, which we'll definitely get into.
De Morgan saw her talent immediately, didn't he? He wasn't just being polite to a noblewoman. He saw something special.
Absolutely. He wrote to Lady Byron suggesting that Ada's skill might lead her to become an original mathematical investigator, perhaps of first-rate eminence. He saw a mind that could synthesize information, not just calculate.
But the key distinction, the philosophical breakthrough that really separates Lovelace from all the other mathematicians and engineers of her era, was her concept of poetical science.
Yes. This is where the suppression of her father's influence finally fails, and his spirit kind of reemerges in her work.
How did she define it?
Well, she called herself an analyst and metaphysician, and she believed that intuition and imagination were not enemies of mathematics, but were actually critical components for applying scientific concepts.
So logic gives you the framework, but imagination is the spark.
Exactly. She even wrote about how watching the abstract transformations of calculus reminded her of certain sprites and fairies who are at one's elbows in one shape now and the next minute in a form most dissimilar.
That's the poet in her coming through.
It is, and that is the bridge that Babbage lacked. Babbage was a brilliant engineer, a brilliant mathematician, but he was grounded in the reality of numbers. Lovelace saw the abstract idea behind the numbers.
Which is what allowed her to see his machine not just as a tool for arithmetic, but as a symbolic medium.
Precisely. Which brings us to Babbage himself. She met him in June 1833, and she was just immediately captivated by the prototype of his difference engine.
And he was equally impressed with her. He saw someone who actually understood the complexity of his work, which was incredibly rare.
He famously nicknamed her the Enchantress of Number.
A great nickname.
And years later, he wrote to her saying, "Forget this world and all its troubles. Everything in short but the Enchantress of Number." He also called her his dear and much admired interpreter.
Interpreter. And that title is so perfect because that's exactly what she was. Her great contribution was interpreting the potential of the analytical engine.
So to really get the significance of her interpretation, you have to understand the engine itself. Babbage had conceived of two monumental machines. The first was the difference engine.
Which was designed for a very specific task.
Right. It was for tabulating polynomials, things like logarithmic tables to eliminate human error in printed books. It was fixed purpose, a sophisticated automated calculator.
Okay.
But the analytical engine, which he conceived of later, that was something else entirely. It was his design for a mechanical general-purpose computer.
General purpose being the key term.
The key term. It had separate components, a store, which was memory, a mill, which was the CPU, and it used punch cards for sequencing instructions. It anticipated the features of modern computers.
And it's been recognized posthumously as being theoretically Turing complete.
Meaning, in theory, this enormous steam-powered machine could compute anything that is computable. But the concept was so radical, so advanced, that almost nobody in the 1840s could grasp its scope.
They just saw a big, expensive calculator.
Exactly. They saw an impossibly large, costly machine. So Babbage had the genius to conceive it, but he failed to communicate its universal potential. And that's where Lovelace comes in. She becomes the bridge.
The opportunity came from a lecture Babbage gave in Turin, Italy in 1840.
Right. A young engineer named Luigi Menabrea transcribed the lecture in French. And then Charles Wheatstone, a friend of Lovelace, commissioned her to translate Menabrea's paper into English. This was in 1842.
And she didn't just translate it. This is the crucial part. She created an entirely new scientific document. She augmented the translation with 7 extensive explanatory notes labeled A through G.
And the sheer volume is just astonishing. Her notes were about 3 times longer than the original article, which just emphasizes that she wasn't just explaining Babbage's design. She was establishing the philosophical and operational foundation for the entire field of computation.
And these notes were so important because the British establishment had basically lost interest in Babbage's projects. They were expensive. They were never finished.
And other scientists who read Menabrea's paper, they struggled to see what was so revolutionary about the analytical engine compared to the difference engine.
So she was effectively writing the entire operating manual and the metaphysical context for a machine that didn't exist.
She was describing software for hardware that only existed in blueprints. It's incredible.
And there was a little bit of tension with Babbage over this, wasn't there? It shows her independence.
There was. Babbage tried to insert his own unsigned preface that was basically just a rant against the government for not funding him.
And she refused.
She refused. She recognized it would undermine the scientific authority of her technical notes. She stood her ground, and it shows that she was a partner in this, not just his scribe or his publicist.
Okay, let's move into the defining part of her legacy, the legendary Note G.
Right. Note G is the absolute pinnacle of her technical contribution. This is where we fully transition from, 19th century mechanics into what we would now call theoretical computer science.
So, what exactly did Note G describe?
Note G described, in full, meticulous, step-by-step detail, a method, an algorithm for calculating a sequence of Bernoulli numbers using the analytical engine.
Okay, for the listener, why are Bernoulli numbers a big deal? Why did she choose them to demonstrate the machine's power?
So Bernoulli numbers are a sequence of rational numbers that pop up all over the place in complex mathematical analysis. They're used for calculating infinite series, for numerical integration. They're very abstract.
So they're not simple numbers you can just get from an arithmetic table. It takes a complex, iterative process to figure them out.
Exactly. To calculate them efficiently, you need more than just addition or multiplication. You need to execute a loop, a repeated structured sequence of operations where variables change on each pass.
You need flow control.
You need flow control. Lovelace's algorithm was a complete demonstration of how to implement iteration and conditional branching on Babbage's machine. It showed the machine could handle complex logic, not just linear calculations.
And this algorithm is widely considered the first published computer program.
The first published computer program. A comprehensive set of instructions designed for a general-purpose machine to solve a highly complex, abstract problem.
Even though, of course, the machine was never built, so the program was never tested. It was a theoretical blueprint.
It was a blueprint. And this is precisely where we hit the most enduring and important historical controversy surrounding Lovelace. The question of who really deserves credit for the program itself.
The authorship question.
The authorship question. And it's critical for you, the learner, to understand both sides because historians still disagree about this.
Okay, so let's start with the argument against her being the original author of the program.
Right. So historians like Alan Bromley and Dorothy Stein have presented a challenge. Bromley pointed out that Babbage's personal notebooks from 1837 to 1840, so well before Lovelace's 1843 notes, contained dozens of sample programs and tables.
So he had written the algorithms before she did.
Unpublished, but yes. Bromley argued there was no evidence Lovelace had the technical knowledge to prepare the program independently. And Babbage himself, in his autobiography, he sort of implied he had done the foundational work.
But he did admit something important, right?
He did. He conceded that Lovelace detected a grave mistake in his original process for the Bernoulli numbers, which forced him to amend it. Now, that detail strongly suggests she was deeply engaged with the technical specifics.
It certainly does. But if Babbage had dozens of his own unpublished algorithms, then isn't calling Lovelace the first programmer more of a symbolic claim than a strictly factual one?
That is a very valid and necessary challenge, and that's where the argument swings back in her favor. Her supporters don't necessarily claim she was the first person to ever conceive of an algorithm.
But the first to publish, and, more importantly, explain the principles of programming itself.
Exactly. The distinction between a private note in a ledger and a public, meticulously detailed explanation. Someone like Stephen Wolfram argues that even if Babbage had prior examples, Lovelace's Bernoulli computation is the most sophisticated or as clean as anything written at the time.
So she perfected the art of algorithmic expression.
And Doran Swade, the Babbage specialist, provides what I think is the most persuasive defense by shifting the focus from just invention to interpretation and vision.
The interpreter.
Right. Swade emphasizes that Lovelace published the first program and, crucially, provided the first clear, comprehensive explanation of the abstract, symbolic operation of the machine, which Babbage himself simply never did.
Swade said Babbage was bound by number. He only ever saw his engines as tools for calculation.
But Lovelace saw something fundamentally different. And this brings us to the ultimate aha moment, the insight that truly makes her the prophet of the computer age. The visionary leap beyond calculation.
This is her lasting legacy.
This is it. Lovelace was the first person to realize that the analytical engine's capability went far beyond number crunching. She recognized that the machine operated on symbols, and those symbols could represent anything, not just quantities.
That conceptual jump is it's huge. It transforms the machine from a calculator into a universal information processor.
And she articulated this so beautifully in her notes using the analogy of music. She wrote that the engine might act upon other things besides number.
This is the famous quote.
Supposing, for instance, that the fundamental relations of pitched sounds were susceptible of such expression, the engine might compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music.
The machine composing music.
Yeah.
In 1843, that is just an astounding piece of foresight. It anticipates digital sound, MIDI, generative AI, everything, by over a century.
This insight that numbers could be coded to represent any entity, musical notes, letters, whatever, and that the machine could manipulate them according to rules, that was the fundamental transition from calculation to general-purpose computation.
And Walter Isaacson points out that the likely inspiration for this was the Jacquard loom.
Yes, the mechanical loom used punched cards to direct the weaving of incredibly complex patterns in fabric. Lovelace had seen them. She realized Babbage's engine used punched cards in the same way to direct the sequence of calculations.
So if punched cards can generate a visual pattern on silk, why couldn't they generate a musical pattern?
Or a logical one. It shifts the focus from the output, which is a number, to the process itself, which is a pattern or a rule. Doran Swed confirms that this transition to seeing the machine as a symbol manipulator was made explicitly by Ada in that 1843 paper.
And beyond that, she also showed incredible foresight about systems architecture, differentiating between the mechanics and the logic.
In Note A, yes, she made this critical distinction. She pointed out the difference between the mechanism of the machine, how it physically works, versus the logical structure of the instructions you give it.
So in modern terms, she's basically suggesting an early concept of hardware and software separation.
She is. And she even noted that the two might require different specialists, that the person who designs the physical machine might not be the same person who designs the logical rules it follows. That level of systems thinking in the 1840s is just breathtaking.
But we also have to talk about the limitation she placed on the machine, the thing that became known as the Lovelace objection.
Yes. Note G also contains her famous statement on machine limitations. She wrote that the analytical engine has no pretensions whatever to originate anything. It can do whatever we know how to order it to perform.
That's the classic challenge to artificial intelligence, isn't it? The idea that computers can only follow prescribed rules. They can't generate new ideas or be truly creative.
And it was a foundational constraint based on the technology she knew. She recognized the machine needed human input for its rules. And that objection was famously challenged much later, in 1950, by Alan Turing in his paper on the Turing test.
This is a wonderful irony. The mind that unlocked the universal potential of the machine was also the first to put a philosophical boundary on its creativity.
It is. And while today, most computer scientists would argue that machine learning can produce emergent behaviors and outputs the programmer didn't anticipate, Lovelace was articulating a profound truth about the nature of symbolic manipulation. It requires rules, and at the start, those rules have to come from us.
So despite these monumental contributions, Lovelace died tragically young. She was only 36 in 1852 from cervical cancer. And her final months, they just sound so intensely sad, dominated by illness and her mother's controlling presence.
Oh, they were deeply troubled. The final months of her life were conducted under the intense, overbearing influence of Lady Byron, who returned to take command of everything.
Right.
Ada went through this forced religious transformation. She was compelled to repent for her past conduct, the gambling, the scandals. Her mother essentially excluded all of Ada's friends and confidants.
And then there's the enduring mystery of the unexplained confession. The accounts suggest she confessed something highly dramatic to her husband, William.
On August 30th of that final year, yes. And whatever it was, it caused this irreparable rift. Her husband immediately abandoned her bedside and refused to have any contact with her for the rest of her life.
And we still don't know what it was.
We don't. Given her history with gambling debts and maybe earlier romantic entanglements, we can only speculate. But it just underscores the high drama that followed her from the beginning of her life to the very, very end.
Poetically, though, she requested to be buried next to the very man whose life she spent running from, yet whose spirit she eventually channeled, her father, Lord Byron.
Even in death, she acknowledged that profound connection. And we shouldn't forget the unfinished ideas she left behind, which just further emphasize her visionary approach.
She was trying to create a calculus of the nervous system,
a mathematical model for how the brain gives rise to thought, how nerves transmit feelings. She was seeking the analytical laws that underlie consciousness itself.
Concepts that would eventually become things like cybernetics and computational neuroscience decades and decades later.
And she also intended to finish a study on the relationship between math and music, fulfilling the exact prediction she made in Note G. Her work was then largely forgotten for almost a century.
Until modern electronic computing started to rise in the mid-20th century.
Exactly. That's when historians and scientists started looking back at Babbage's blueprints and, crucially, at Lovelace's notes, and they finally realized their monumental significance.
And that realization led to her digital immortality through all the commemoration we see today. The most famous is probably the computer language, Ada.
Yes, developed for the U.S. Department of Defense in the late 70s, early 80s for these high-reliability, real-time computing systems.
And I love this detail. The military standard for the language is designated MIL STD 1815.
A direct reference to her birth year, 1815. It's a permanent, structural tribute right inside the world of computer architecture. It recognizes her foundational role.
And her influence extends across so many honors and institutions. The British Computer Society has the Lovelace Medal. There's the Ada Lovelace Award for Women in Computing.
And her name has become this incredibly important symbol for equality and representation in science.
Absolutely. There's Ada Lovelace Day every October, specifically to raise the profile of women in STEM.
It serves as this really necessary corrective to decades of historical omission.
She's also successfully permeated pop culture, which is fantastic because it means her recognition isn't just limited to, academic circles.
The image is ubiquitous now. Since 2015, all new British passports have an illustration of Lovelace and Babbage.
I did not know that.
Yeah. She's been in Google Doodles, on Doctor Who. She's a playable leader in the Civilization video games.
And the tech industry itself continues to honor her in these really specific ways, connecting her name directly to the most advanced computational power we have today.
The connection is profound. NVIDIA, for example, named its 2022 GPU microarchitecture the Ada Lovelace architecture.
That's huge.
It's the engine that powers modern AI and massive data processing, and it's dedicated to her legacy. And in the crypto world, the Cardano platform uses Ada as the name for its token and Lovelace as the smallest subunit.
So they've essentially used her name to define the currency of a new digital economy.
So you have this incredible, improbable story. A woman born under the cloud of scandalous poetry, educated in logic to suppress her artistic side, who ends up bridging the gap between mathematics and imagination. She didn't just write a program, she created the very concept of software. And now her name powers the most advanced systems on the planet. Hashtag outro. So if we look back across this entire deep dive, Lovelace's lasting contribution, it was fundamentally a conceptual and a philosophical one. It wasn't just the single Bernoulli algorithm that mattered most.
Right.
It was her revolutionary, explicit articulation of computation as the manipulation of symbols according to abstract rules.
That is the core takeaway. She established the essential groundwork for the modern digital age, where all information, music, text, genetic code can be encoded and processed. She saw the abstract universal power of the machine, while Babbage, fundamentally, still saw a giant, complex calculator.
She was, and she remains, the interpreter for humanity. She explained not just what the analytical engine was physically, but what it could be logically and creatively. If she saw an AI compose a piece of music that fulfilled her 1843 prediction, would she still maintain that the machine was only following orders prescribed by its training data? Or would she find a new set of analytical rules, a new calculus that could define, mathematically, the moment of synthetic originality?
A wonderful challenge to the constraints of our digital age, a challenge posed by the very woman who launched it. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Ada Lovelace, the true prophet of the computer age.
We'll see you next time.